I have worked Rimrock Mesa for going on 23 years, and in that time I have seen cattle drives and dry summers and 2 men shot dead over a fence line and one winter that buried the bunkhouse to the eaves. I have seen things I would not have believed if somebody told me first. But I will tell you flat, the strangest and the best thing I ever watched happen on this mesa was a little girl with a fever asking one quiet question, and a hard man who hadn't cried since his wife's burial finding out he still could. That is what I saw. I will tell it straight. Gage Linden was not a cruel man. I want to make that plain. He was not a man who raised his voice or his hand. But 2 winters before all this, his wife Marta died of a lung sickness she had been carrying quiet for too long, and something in Gage went with her into that frozen ground. He kept on. He worked the cattle, he fed the children, he kept the ranch from falling apart. But he did it the way a man shovels in the cold, head down, no waste, get through. His oldest boy Clem was 14 and had learned to match his father's silence. His middle boy Rudd was 11 and had learned to test everything he couldn't match. And his youngest, Della, was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes and had never in her life been told there was anything she couldn't ask. The women of Caldwell Flats had heard about those 3 children before any of them set foot on the ranch. 3 women had answered Gage's advertisement for a housekeeper in the 2 years since Marta died. The first lasted 8 days. The second lasted 12. The third came on a Tuesday and was gone by Friday noon. Rudd was not malicious, he was a boy in pain who had not been handed any other tools. Clem was not hostile, he was protecting a grief he didn't have words for. And Della was not wild at all. Della just asked questions without cease from the moment she woke until the moment she slept, and most grown women found that exhausting. Those of us who knew her found it the best thing about her. I was the one who rode to Nora Callum's place. It was past 10 at night in October, a hard wind coming off the high ground, and Della had been burning with fever since midday. Gage had sent Clem for Doc Harlan in town, but Doc Harlan was out delivering twins 20 miles east and wasn't expected back before morning. I knew Nora's place, everybody on the mesa knew Nora's place, in the same way they knew where the well was and where the nearest hard shelter stood. You knew it because someday you would need it. Nora Callum was 38 years old and had been widowed at 26 when her husband's horse threw him into a dry creek bed. She had stayed on in their small house at the edge of the mesa because she knew plants and bodies and the particular way the sick needed tending, and because the valley needed her more than it ever quite admitted. She came when babies came early and when fevers climbed and when old men were easing toward their last. The valley took that as simply the way of things. What they paid her was never enough and they all knew it and nobody said so. She was not plain and she was not beautiful in any way that made men look twice in a busy room. She was capable and calm and carried herself like a woman who had long since stopped waiting to be noticed. The valley did not notice her. It just reached for her when things went wrong. She opened her door before I finished knocking. She had a lamp and a canvas bag already half sorted. I said, "Linden girl. High fever, going on 9 hours." She said, "Give me 2 minutes." She was on her horse in 3. Della was burning. I had seen enough fevers to know the difference between the kind that breaks and the kind that means business, and this one meant business. Nora set her bag on the floor beside the girl's bed, pressed her hands to Della's face and throat and chest, pulled back the blanket and checked the child's feet, and did all of it with such quiet efficiency that the room seemed to calm simply because she was in it. Gage stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. I had not seen him take his hat off indoors in 2 years. He stood there and watched Nora work and did not say a single word. She stayed. Not just that night. She stayed 3 nights and 3 days, sleeping in the chair beside Della's bed for an hour here and 2 hours there, waking the moment the girl's breathing changed. She brought the fever down in stages, the way you bring a spooked horse in, patient, steady, no sudden moves. She showed Clem how to keep the compress cool and showed Rudd how to boil the broth and gave them both something to do with their hands, which was the smartest thing anybody had done for those 2 boys in 2 years. She did not talk over much. She answered what was asked and she worked. I watched Gage through all of it. He had a way of appearing in doorways, the bedroom door, the kitchen door, the door to the porch, and standing there for a stretch before moving on. He was checking on Della, which was natural. But I noticed after a while that he was checking on Nora too. There was something in the way he watched her that I recognized but could not have named. It was the way a man looks at something he had forgotten existed. Not hunger. Something quieter and older than hunger. On the second night, around 2 in the morning, I brought Nora a cup of coffee because I could not sleep. She was sitting with her hands around the cup and her eyes on Della, who had gone into a real sleep for the first time. I said, "You've seen worse than this." She said, "I've seen worse." She was quiet a moment. "She's going to be fine." I said, "I figured so." She said, "Your rancher's been standing in that doorway every 2 hours." I said, "That's about right." She didn't say anything else. She drank her coffee and watched the girl sleep. By the third morning, Della's fever had broken clean. Color was coming back to her face and she was starting to ask questions again, which Rudd said was a terrible sign and which the rest of us understood was the best sign there was. Nora packed her bag slowly and washed her hands at the basin and told Clem what to watch for in the next few days, calm as a schoolteacher at the end of a lesson. That was when Della grabbed Nora's hand. She looked up at her with those eyes that were Marta Linden's eyes, and she said, "Will you be our mama now?" The room went still. I was at the table with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth and I did not move. Rudd stared at the floor. Clem looked at the window. Nora looked down at the girl and her face did something complicated and tender, and she said, very gently, "Oh, sweetheart." And she held the girl's hand a moment, not saying yes and not saying no, and there was a long quiet. I did not look at Gage. But I felt him there in that doorway. Nora finished packing her bag. She told Della she would check on her in a week. She pulled on her coat and she went out to the barn to saddle her mare. I stayed at the table. Rudd and Clem stayed where they were. After about half a minute, Gage put his hat on and followed her. I did not follow. That was not my business. But the barn had thin walls and the morning was still, and I was not trying to listen, but I heard. I heard him say her name. Just that, Nora, and then a silence, and then he said, "I'm not good at this." She said, "I know." He said, "I haven't been good at much of anything the last 2 years except keeping the cattle alive and getting the children fed." She said she had noticed the children were well fed. He said, "That girl in there. She's got her mother's way of asking the one thing you weren't ready for." Nora didn't say anything to that. He said, "I can't offer you what I'd want to offer. Not yet. But I'm asking you to stay. Not as help. Not for wages. I'm asking because Della needs you and Rudd needs you and Clem won't say it but he does too. And because I have stood in that doorway 3 times a night for 3 nights watching you work and I have not thought of anything else. I don't know what to do with that. But I know I don't want you to ride out." There was a long quiet. She said, "Gage." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have been tending this valley for 12 years and I have ridden away from every house I helped put back together. I am tired of riding away." He said, "Then don't." Another silence. Then she said, so quiet I near missed it, "You'll have to ask me proper." He said, "I'm working up to it." I heard her laugh. Soft and short, the kind of laugh a woman holds back and then can't. I had not heard Nora Callum laugh in I don't know how long. Maybe none of us had thought to give her occasion. I got up from the table and went out the back and checked on the horses that did not need checking on, and gave the 2 of them the morning. He did ask her proper. That Sunday, as it happened, rode to her place himself, without Clem along as excuse, and came back an hour and a half later wearing an expression I had not seen on his face in 2 years. Della wanted to know everything he had said and he told her it was between him and Nora. Rudd said that was unfair. Clem, for the first time in recent memory, smiled at his father. Not a big smile. Just a small, real one. Nora Callum married Gage Linden the following April, when the mesa was as close to soft as it ever gets. There was no fuss about it. Doc Harlan stood up with them and I handed Gage the ring and Della wore her mother's good ribbon in her hair. Rudd fidgeted through the whole ceremony and Clem stood straight as a soldier beside his father. Afterward, Della took Nora's hand, then took her father's hand, and walked between them out into the April sun like it was the most natural thing in the world. Which I suppose it was. I have thought about it since, the strange arithmetic of how a family remakes itself. How a little girl's question can do what a grown man's stubbornness has held off for 2 years. How the woman the valley reached for in every emergency was the one nobody thought to look at in the ordinary daylight. Gage Linden saw her. Took him 3 nights in a doorway to get there, but he saw her. Della knew first. Della always knew. She had her mother's eyes, and I think she had her mother's sense of how things ought to be, and she just went ahead and said so. Some things work out. Not all of them, not most of them, not on a mesa ranch in Wyoming territory where the winters are long and the work is hard and the ground takes people too soon. But some things do. This was one of those. I watched it happen from close enough to know it was real, and I will take that to my grave as one of the few things I am purely glad I lived to see.